Good evening and welcome. This debate, of course, features the three candidates for the U.S. Senate seat being vacated by Senate Majority Leader Howard Baker. The candidates, as you know, are Ed McAteer, independent from Memphis, Tennessee, Victor Ashe, the Republican candidate from Knoxville, and Albert Gore, Jr., the Democratic candidate from Carthage, Tennessee. The members of the panel who will be addressing questions to the candidates are Edie Ellis, co-anchor and reporter from WBIR-TV, Channel 10 here in Knoxville, Dr. Bill Lyons, who is professor of political science from the University of Tennessee, Bob Hetherington, reporter, the Knoxville Journal, and Larry Calvert, editor of the University of Tennessee Daily Beacon. To recap briefly some of the rules of the debate, we've gone over this with the candidates and with the questioners, but once again, I will be asking the first question, and each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer that question. A random draw has already been held to determine the order in which the candidates will answer, and they are Mr. McAteer from my left, Senator Ashe, and Representative Gore. Following the first question that I'm asking, then the panelists will address a question to one of the candidates. He will be given 1.5 minutes in which to answer. After that, the other two candidates then will be given 30 seconds to rebut. The closing portion of the debate of the forum this evening, each candidate will have the opportunity to ask the other two candidates a question. Each reply will be no longer than 2 minutes. The order of that questioning has also been determined by a draw. The order of rebuttal will be according to alphabetical order. Candidates may not directly address each other except to ask the question in the final part of the program. Now, a word to the audience. Any interruptions in response to a candidate will be deducted from the time of that candidate. Continued interruptions could result in a request to leave. Now, the first question, again, each of you will have 2 minutes to answer this question, and these three people right down here are the timers. You'll see a green card when you have 30 seconds left. You'll see a yellow card when you have 15 seconds, and when your time is over, you will see a red card. Now, here's the question. Recent polls have shown the Reagan-Bush ticket to be very strong here in Tennessee. A poll released last week showed that Reagan was leading Mondale by about 26 percentage points. If those figures stand up and go through November 6th, there will be a landslide victory for Reagan here in Tennessee. If that happens, how will it affect your candidacy? Mr. McAteer.
Well, of course, the key word in your question is the word if. And there are a lot of things that can be said about the word if. The facts of the case are that if Mr. Reagan does hold up, I believe because of the positions that I take along with Mr. Reagan have been for some 10 years in supporting him, it will bode good for my candidacy. Mr. Reagan and I both believe in a strong national defense. We both are opposed to coercive government power that plunders certain elements of society and doles out to others. We both are opposed to the socialist welfare state that demotivates productive people by robbing them in the name of doing good, and demotivates, dehumanizes, and will destroy the unproductive by developing a state of dependency. Mr. Reagan and I both believe that the most important thing that God gives an individual is human life. We both believe that the main responsibility of government is to protect that life. We both feel that God gave children to parents, not to the federal government. We are both constitutionalists. We both believe that the $1.5 trillion national debt is an atrocity that is not only facing the people who are living today, but will be fostered upon our children and our children's children. And I've been supporting Mr. Reagan for some 10 years, and neither one of my opponents can say that. We have one of them who has consistently opposed him in the U.S. Congress. We have another one who opposed his nomination, and typical of his candidacy, he grabs hold of coattails when he thinks that those coattails can help him get elected. So I believe that the people of Tennessee are common sense people, and as my message gets out that I'm a constitutionalist, that I'm a Tennessean and believes in those things that the people of Tennessee believe in, I believe that that will bode good for me.
Mr. Ashe.
I'm proud to have President Reagan's active endorsement of my candidacy for the United States Senate. But I'm running for the United States Senate because I believe I can make a difference. Just as for the last 15 years representing this, my hometown, in the Tennessee House of Representatives and in the Tennessee State Senate. in working for the betterment of our community with the sponsorship of the bond authorization for I-640, the four-laning of Nayland Drive, the Art and Architecture building here on the UT campus, the Walters Life Science building, the School of Veterinary Medicine, all of which I supported, and all of which reflect the commitment that I have to making the district that I represented, and hopefully in 4 weeks the state of Tennessee, a better place in which to live. I've been a very independent state legislator. Everyone knows that. And my candidacy for the United States Senate is based on being not only a senator from Tennessee, but a senator for Tennessee. And that's what this campaign's all about. 4 weeks from tomorrow, Tennesseans will have a clear choice. They'll have the Mondale Gore team on one side, and the $157 a month tax increase which that represents. And we heard Mr. Mondale last night speaking out against tax indexing, speaking out against a constitutional amendment for school prayer. We heard him offer a clear choice, a choice that I don't agree with, but certainly a clear choice. On the other hand, we have the Reagan-Ashe team, a team which believes in keeping your money at home and in the pockets of Tennesseans, that the government indeed is not, that the taxpayers of this state are not undertaxed, but that the government is overfed. And that's a clear choice that Tennesseans have to decide on November the 6th. So I think the race for the United States Senate is clearly related to the presidential race, because a United States Senator not only votes on the legislative programs, but also on the treaties that the President submits to the Senate, as well as confirmation of federal judges, as well as confirmation of cabinet members. So the success of President Reagan in the next 4 years will very well be tied to who serves in the United States Senate.
Mr. Gore.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank WBIR and the Knoxville Journal and the UT Issues Committee for co-sponsoring this debate. Your first question is, if President Reagan wins a landslide victory for re-election, how will that affect the race for the United States Senate? I don't think it would have very much effect, and the reason is, well, there's several reasons. First of all, Tennesseans have proven in the past that they split their tickets more than the voters of any other state. In our last statewide election, 2 years ago, a very popular Republican governor won re-election in a landslide victory, and then one space down on the same ballot, a Democratic senator won by an even larger landslide. I think that's because Tennesseans realize that races for different offices are different races. I think they realize that this campaign for the United States Senate is not just an extension of the presidential race. Tennesseans need a senator who will stand on his own 2 feet, one who will fight for Tennessee and take his directions from Tennesseans. In my service of 8 years in the United States Congress, I've done that by having an average of 4 town hall meetings every single week for all of those 8 years, coming home on a regular basis and staying in close touch. Now, there's another reason why I think that the presidential race is not likely to have much effect on the Senate race, and that is that there is something about President Reagan that makes many of his strong supporters nevertheless want to have people in the legislative branch of government who will operate the system of checks and balances, support him strongly when he's right, but offer constructive alternatives when he's not. When he ran for re-election as governor of California, he won a landslide victory, and yet Democrats in the state legislature made the largest gains in the history of California. I think that Tennesseans want an independent senator who's not a rubber stamp or a coat tailor, and I'm asking for the support not only of Democrats, but of independents and independently thinking Republicans as well.
Now it's time for questions from our panel of journalists. You journalists may pick a candidate of your choice, ask a question. You have a minute and a half to respond, and then 30 seconds from each of the following other candidates for rebuttal. Ms. Ellis.
Thank you very much, Bill. A related question in 2 parts for Mr. Gore. Mr. Gore, is the Mondale-Ferraro ticket an asset or a liability in your campaign, and did last night's presidential debate change your view in any way?
Well, as I said before, I do think that these 2 races are very separate. It's of course no secret that in the public opinion polls, President Reagan is far ahead in this state, but you know, the public opinion polls are taken very early on, and I think last night's debate was a very interesting debate. And as to whether or not it will change things, in answer to your question, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see the results of those samplings of people who watch the debate and see what they think the effect is. But as far as the relationship between the presidential campaign and the Senate campaign, I've addressed myself to that issue, and I honestly and sincerely believe that Tennesseans very strongly want a United States Senator who will work on a bipartisan basis with Democrats and Republicans, who will work with the President when he is right, and who will offer constructive alternatives when alternatives will better serve the public interest. That's the approach that I've taken in the United States Congress, and if I'm privileged to serve in the United States Senate, that's the approach that I will take representing Tennessee there. My principal direction will come from Tennesseans, and I want to pledge this evening that I will have regular town hall meetings in all 95 counties throughout this state to talk about our priorities, to talk about what we ought to be doing in this country, and to talk about how I can be most effective as Tennessee's senator if I'm privileged to serve in that capacity.
Mr. Ashe, rebuttal.
The fact is, the Mondale-Ferraro ticket does have an impact in Tennessee because they represent what Tennessee does not want. Mrs. Ferraro's vote against the tax cut, which Mr. Gore joined her on. The fact is, Mr. Gore spent 90 seconds and never once mentioned the name Mondale. I want to up my offer. A week ago, I offered $5 if he would mention the word Mondale. Tonight, I offer $10 to the Knoxville Journal Milk Fund if sometime during tonight's debate, he will mention the word Mondale once. The fact is, it is relevant because we don't need a senator who's going to vote for the Mondale $85 million tax increase.
Mr. McAteer, rebuttal.
Yes, well, really, even though there are three of us standing up here tonight, there are only two of us, two philosophies in this Senate race. One of them is represented by Mondale and Ferraro, endorsed by Mr. Gore, and somewhat through Mr. Ashe's mentor in the Senate, Mr. Howard Baker. That philosophy is also endorsed. The other philosophy is the philosophy that I represent, which is a conservative philosophy. And so I believe that not only is it the obligation of the people of Tennessee.
Mr. McAteer, your time is up. I'm sorry. Dr. Lyons, your question.
A question for Mr. Ashe. For many years, there's been growing dissatisfaction with the federal income tax system.
I didn't hear the question.
For many years, there's been growing dissatisfaction with the federal income tax system. It's perceived as being inequitable and by many as being needlessly complex. There have been two recent suggestions in overhauling this, a flat rate income tax or a value-added or national sales tax. How do you feel about either of these alternatives and the tax system in general?
I'm not for a value-added sales tax. I do support a modified flat income tax proposal, whether it's along the lines of Bradley Gephardt or the Kemp-Caxton, and I suspect a compromise will be evolved between those two. But the point is, there are an awful lot of tax loopholes, and I think Tennesseans are outraged by the fact that some people who make better than $100,000 a year pay very little in federal income taxes, while people with more modest incomes pay a very high percentage of their federal income taxes, and that ought to change. And I think that's part of the impetus behind the modified flat tax. I think deductions for charities, for educational institutions, to your church or your synagogue, or home mortgage interest deductions should be maintained. I also think that if we go to just a couple of tax brackets, that tax indexing should be maintained. And Bradley Gephardt would repeal tax indexing. Walter Mondale last night said he would urge repeal of tax indexing. Tax indexing is one of the most fair proposals that the Congress has ever enacted because it simply says that you will not be penalized for a cost of living wage increase. That is, that if you get a cost of living wage increase, you will not be pushed up into a higher tax bracket. Mr. Gore, when he had a chance to vote for tax indexing and for the tax cut, he voted no. He now says he supports it. I hope he does. But the record is that when he had a chance to vote yes, he voted no, along with Mrs. Ferraro, along with Walter Mondale, Tip O'Neill, and Ted Kennedy. And that was a vote which was out of step with Tennessee.
Mr. Gore.
Well, first of all, I'm going to answer the question specifically, but first of all, I want to donate the $10 to the Knoxville Milk Fund in the name of Victor Ashe and Walter Mondale. Now, audience, please. Secondly, let me say that I am not for a value-added tax. I am for a modified flat rate tax that would eliminate all but a handful of deductions and have two progressive surcharges on higher incomes. I'm strongly in favor of maintaining tax indexing.
Mr. Gore, I'm sorry, your time is over. Mr. McAteer.
Yeah, I'm strongly in favor of the flat rate 10% tax that has been introduced by Congressman Mark Siljander from the great state of Michigan. And I believe that the income tax does need to be reformed. However, I would like to also add that most of the time that we spend talking and thinking about taxes, and I'm strongly in favor of the federal government stop spending so that taxes that are raised by the American people will pay the debts and not have us $1.5 trillion in the national debt.
Thank you, Mr. McAteer.
Mr. McAteer, this question's for you. Your campaign material attacks your opponents for their stand on the Equal Rights Amendment, on abortion, and for what you describe as pro-homosexual legislation. You urge Tennesseans, quote, who truly want to see our nation led by godly men to unite, end quote, and to vote for you. And you tell them, quote, God will see that their vote is not wasted. Mr. McAteer, are your opponents ungodly men because their views differ with yours?
Will Durant, in his monumental work, The History of Civilization, pointed out that it was not economic disarray, political ineptness, nor military weakness that destroyed civilizations, but rather it was the moral, spiritual decay that brought those nations and those civilizations down. Now, the personal life of a representative is not as important as the way that they vote and the way that they fail many times to exert leadership. Our first great president, George Washington, I believe, to my own satisfaction, portrayed in a statement what leadership is all about. He said that it is the privilege, it is the responsibility of leadership to raise a standard so that when the wise and the honest want to, they can repair to it. I think any thinking person today realizes that Western civilization is in a moral crisis. Today, 100 little children, 140, vanish, never to be heard from again. 1,600 teenagers or young people from the ages of 3 to 18 every 24 hours are raped, mutilated, and abused by the $10 billion pornography business in America. Some 18 million little preborn babies have been denied their life after the Supreme Court decision of 1973. So I stand by my position that we're in a moral crisis, and leadership is absolutely necessary in every level to correct that crisis.
Mr. Ash.
I think both of my opponents are fine personal individuals and have a moral record that is exemplary. That's not the issue in the campaign. The question that you raised, Bob, in regard to those three issues are, one, I do not support abortion. I oppose federal funding of abortion. I do not support the ERA as presently written, and I do not support homosexual legislation.
Mr. Gore.
Well, let me say, first of all, that I have not gotten the implication from what Mr. McAteer has said that he's trying to claim that his opponents are ungodly in any way. I respect his deep convictions, and moreover, I think that the people that he is speaking for in this race have a right to be heard and ought to have been heard in the Republican primary as well. I want to encourage the deeper involvement of all of those with strong moral convictions to get more involved in the political process. I think our country is going to be better for it.
Mr. Calvin.
Congressman Gore, it's your position that a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution is necessary. In fact, you've now co-sponsored one, and that taxes are a last resort solution to the federal deficit. In addition, one of your recent TV spots is featuring nice things that the President and other administration officials are saying about you. And it seemed that your answers to the questions posed by Mr. Williams and Ms. Ellis were less than ringing endorsements of the Mondale-Ferraro ticket. My question, sir, is this. Have you swung to the right in this campaign? And if so, why?
Well, perhaps your perception of me has swung to the right during the campaign as you have become more familiar with what my views are. During the last 8 years, I have represented one of the most conservative congressional districts in the state of Tennessee. It's almost evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, and yet 3 of the 4 times that I've been on the ballot there, the Republicans have not put up any opposition at all. Now, the last time I had a primary, the voters there gave me 96% of the vote. I think the judgment of Tennesseans during 4 trips to the ballot box is the most eloquent testimony about whether or not my views are in the mainstream of Tennessee. What your perception of my views was before the race began might well have been influenced by the charges made by my opponents on the campaign trail. But after you have had an opportunity to listen to my views and to look at what I have been able to accomplish in the Congress, I hope you'll agree with me that the principal issue in this race is who can be most effective and do the best job for Tennessee. I hope you'll agree that the best way to answer that central question is to look at the performance of the candidates. During my 8 years in the Congress, I think I've represented my constituents well and reflected their viewpoints. I've come home an average of 4 times a week for town hall meetings, and I've maintained at the same time a 98% voting and attendance record. So I hope that your perception of my views will be even more accurate by the time the campaign is over with.
Mr. Ashe.
My record has been one of leadership, effective leadership, and that's been validated by the voters here in my hometown in re-electing me to the state legislature by better than 60 to 70% of the vote every time I've had the opportunity to run. The fact is, Mr. Gore, perception that he would like for you to have is a lot different from the reality, because he supported Carter Mondale 75% of the time when they were in office, and he has led the opposition to President Reagan's domestic economic recovery programs by voting against the tax cut, which offered tax cuts to Tennesseans, 25%
Mr.
more.
McAteer.
Yes, I'm for a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. However, before that takes place, I'm for stopping talking about debt ceilings and freeze the national budget where it is. 1980, the national budget was $546 billion. Today, it's $945 billion. We have a deficit of $200 billion today, and had we frozen the budget in 1980, according to the Grace Commission, we could have, because he says, and I believe him, we could take $414 billion out of the budget.
All right, Edie.
Mr. McAteer, you have said publicly that any project you undertake, including the senatorial race, is a missionary project. How does your missionary role relate to the traditional separation of church and state in this country?
Well, separation of church and state, properly understood, I don't believe has a stronger advocate in America than Ed McAteer. I'm definitely opposed to church suppressing state or vice versa. Our forefathers who came from the old oligarchy of Europe and eventually the totalitarian governments of Asia and Africa understood that problem. However, we must understand today there is a difference in separating church and state and taking God out of government. A lot of the problems that we have, most of them I submit today, are the problems that directly relate to the moral, spiritual decline of our nation. And I believe that it's incumbent upon the leadership of this nation, in the homes, the churches, and yes, the government, who is attacking those moral foundations by bills like abortion, prayer out of the public schools, a humanistic philosophy, and those things that are destroying the base of our nation. We talk all the time about the economy, about foreign policy, about national defense. Those are important issues. But unless as a people we understand where our real problem is and begin to deal with that problem, then we will be relegated to those republics in the past who have forgotten that there has to be a God consciousness and a moral foundation, or nations will crumble. So I will take, everywhere I go, my moral, spiritual philosophy with all of my heart and with all the energy that God has placed in me to do so.
Mr. Ashe.
I think all of us believe very strongly in the separation of church and state. I wish that more people who hold deeply religious views would become involved in the political process. And I commend the churches which across Tennessee have conducted voter registration drives. Now that that's concluded, it's important that you, the voters, the viewers tonight, exercise your right to vote. But in addition to that, we have two choices tonight. The Mondale-Gore approach and that $157 a month tax increase which he offers, or the Reagan-Ashe approach, which believes in letting the American free enterprise system work and go forward.
Mr. Ashe, your time is up. Thank you. Mr. Gore.
I believe in the separation of church and state and the separation of the presidential race and the Senate race.
Audience. Please.
I also want to say that I agree with Ed McAteer and others that we do have a crisis of values that must be addressed. For most Americans, religious faith is the touchstone of those values and offers the roadmap for the way back. We must maintain separation of church and state, and we must also get
Your
more
time
people
is up.
involved in politics with
Mr.
traditional
Gore,
values.
I'm sorry, your time is up.
Sorry.
The applause took too much time. I'd like to caution the audience once again. I know it's hard to sit on your hands, but we would like for you to do that, please. We'll continue with the questioning now. Bill.
Question for Mr. Gore. In the past decade, many American industries have suffered greatly because of foreign competition. Steel and auto industries have been particularly hard hit. Consumers, however, often benefit from price and product competition. Many have suggested import quotas in some industries. Others have mentioned domestic content legislation. How do you stand on this issue?
Well, I have opposed domestic content legislation, and I also favor reciprocal free trade. The congressional district which I now represent in the Congress was once represented by a great Tennessean, Cordell Hull, who went on, of course, to be Secretary of State, and exactly 50 years ago this year authored the Reciprocal Free Trade Act. Since that time, and particularly during the post-war years, the economies of the free world have greatly benefited from reciprocal free trade. But often that word reciprocal is dropped off and only free trade is mentioned. I do believe that what's fair for one should be fair for the other. I have been a strong supporter of reciprocal free trade, and it is that belief which has led me to oppose the domestic content legislation. There are, however, some situations where industries in the United States are facing unfair competition with government subsidies from nations with which we are competing and other unfair trading practices. In other respects, we have seen unfair relationships locked in by past treaties, which I think should be changed. Now, to take a somewhat broader view of the question, I honestly believe that the wave of protectionist sentiment which is coming across the country today must also be dealt with by getting the value of the American dollar back into a reasonable range and making our exports more competitive in the world and stop artificially subsidizing imports. But I believe in reciprocal free trade.
All right, Mr. Ash, rebuttal.
I strongly believe in fair trade on a reciprocal basis, and that's the way it ought to be. I agree that domestic content legislation should not be enacted, but I don't see how you can oppose domestic content and then Mr. Gore co-sponsor steel quota legislation, which would result in a 10% price increase for Tennessee consumers. You're not being a friend of the Tennessee consumer when you co-sponsor steel quota legislation, and it's out of step with your opposition to domestic content legislation. We must have fair trade. It must be reciprocal. I think Ambassador Bill Brock is doing an excellent job in this area.
Mr. McAteer.
I'm opposed to the domestic content idea. I'm against protectionism. I'm a strong, free enterprise individual. We represent 6% of the world's population. Last year, the gross national product of the 6% of the world's population was greater than the next 3.5 nations in the world put together, which represents 2 billion people. And I submit that our free market system that says the marketplace, better than the bureaucracy, best knows how to distribute goods, is the idea we should continue with.
Bob?
Senator Ash, the United States gives military and economic aid to El Salvador despite its human rights record. It provides, through the CIA, support for anti-government guerrillas in Nicaragua, and U.S. troops are on exercises in Honduras and have been for about 2 years. As a senator from the volunteer state, under what specific circumstances will you support the commitment of U.S. troops into combat in Central America?
First of all, should that occur, it would be because the President recommended it and the President as Commander-in-Chief did that. And it would be up to the Congress to decide after that 90-day period as to whether or not there should be an extension of time, such as the Congress voted for the situation in Lebanon. Let me say this in regard to Central America. We have a definite interest in what goes on there. When you're in El Paso, Texas, you're closer to San Salvador than you are to New York City. We have a freely elected government in El Salvador. More people percentage-wise voted in their most recent presidential election than voted in the most recent American presidential election, and they did it under threats of bullet, gunfire, and intimidation. And they're be commended. And we ought to support President Duarte in his efforts to maintain a free government. And we should support him in those efforts to thwart the Sandinistas who from Nicaragua are exporting revolution into that country and overturning the decision of the ballot box. That does not mean sending American troops there, but it does mean in providing economic and military assistance. Additionally, I think we should assist those who would want to bring about a free election, a real free election, and not a communist-type plebiscite in Nicaragua. So those should be the goals of the United States. In regard to the specific question, until you know the facts and the circumstances at hand, you should not commit yourself one way or another. Let me say this, my disposition is very much against sending any American soldiers to Central America. But whoever the president is, whether it's Reagan or Mondale, as a member of the United States Senate, I'm going to cast a vote if that unfortunate situation came, which is in the best interest of Tennessee and America.
Thank you, Mr. Ash. Mr. Gore, your rebuttal?
Yes, as a member of the Intelligence Committee in the Congress, I have dealt in detail with this issue, and I want to answer your question specifically. If Nicaragua or Cuba launched an armed and unprovoked invasion of another country in Central America, and if the President of the United States requested the presence of U.S. troops, under those circumstances, I would support it. I have also supported aid to the government of El Salvador, although I think the so-called Contra invasion of Nicaragua is counterproductive to our efforts to work with our allies to secure a peaceful resolution of the problems there.
Thank you, Mr. Gore. Mr. McAteer.
Central America is very critical to our preservation as a free society today. I'm more concerned about what the Sandinistas are doing by the Cuba-backed communist regime than I am the freedom fighters. We must understand that Central America is a very critical place in our safety today. And I'm for U.S. troop involvement as a last resort to preserve America. We must have a foreign policy in Central America.
Thank you, Mr. McAteer. Your question, Larry.
Mr. McAteer, I'd like to touch again for a moment on a specific aspect of the question Mr. Hetherington asked you. You said in Chattanooga, I believe, that you were not against PAC money on principle, but wouldn't accept any, quote, from a lesbian queer organization. Are you worried that some voters may find you intolerant and decide to cast their ballot for one of the other two candidates?
No, I'm really not, because I believe that the people of Tennessee are good, moral, intelligent people, and they are concerned about the 140 children that are vanishing every day, the connection that the pornography business has with that, the 600,000 children who are being abused every year. And so the people of Tennessee are more concerned about the protection of their children and what's good for this state than they are in protecting the reputation of people who are living abnormal, sinful lifestyles.
All right, thank you, Mr. McAteer. Mr. Ash.
I have not received nor would I accept donations from such an organization.
Mr. Gore.
Nor have I.
We continue with our questioning. Edie Ellis. Edie?
Mr. Ash, to borrow a question from last night's presidential debate, what leadership qualities do you think you possess that your opponents do not?
I think I possess the leadership qualities of being very independent and speaking my mind, and I think that's what Tennesseans want in the United States Senate. That's been my record for 15 years as a state representative and as a state senator. Haven't always won popularity contests with my fellow colleagues, but I've always won the support of the people back home who I was sent there to represent, because I stood up and fought against legislative pay raises, against legislative pensions. And when Ray Blanton was there with patronage committees that were telling people who could be hired at Lakeshore Mental Health Institute, when he fired the superintendent, Earl Nenow, at Western State Mental Health Institute, I led the effort in asking that those actions be investigated. And yes, a lot of Democratic legislators really didn't like it. I put them on the spot where they needed to be. And I think history has borne out the correctness of my position on that issue. The fact of the matter is, I possess the leadership which has passed meaningful legislation in the Tennessee General Assembly. Campaign financial disclosure, removing the sales tax from prescription drugs to assist senior citizens, in sponsoring better roads in this area, I-640, the 4-laning in Nayland Drive, the elimination of Malfunction Junction along with Governor Alexander and Transportation Commissioner Bill Sampson. The fact of the matter is, I represent the type of leadership that I think is needed in the United States Senate to work with President Reagan over the next 4 years, as opposed to my opponent who will work with Walter Mondale. The fact is, that's a clear choice that Tennesseans over the next 4 weeks will have to wrestle with and make up their mind as to who will best serve Tennessee.
Mr. Ash, your time is up. Mr. Gore?
I'd like to bring it back to the Senate race again, if I could. The issue is effectiveness. I believe that my record of 8 years in the Congress offers many examples of how I can be effective. Just this past week, I passed several pieces of legislation, the National Organ Transplant Act, the Career Criminal Act, which is part of the new crime bill. I'm the principal sponsor of the National Health Fair Program. This coming week, I'll pass the Commission on Human Genetic Engineering. I wrote the bipartisan arms control plan, or central elements of it, that our negotiators are taking to Geneva, to the Soviet Union's negotiators. And my time has run out here, but I've got a list that maybe I can come back to it.
Mr. McAteer.
I offer the leadership in the areas of experience, maturity, and courage. An ex-Navy veteran helped furnishing the air support for General Douglas MacArthur during the war. 28 years with the Colgate-Palmolive Company, selling the world's finest toothpaste. Married for 35 years, 5 grandchildren and 2 children. Having traveled the world for some 30 years, I have a good understanding of foreign policy, opposed to so-called political realism, which is a rule of expediency and has no place in the moral order. National Field Director of the Conservative Caucus and the Freedom Foundation.
Your time is up as well. The time is concluded now for questions from the panel, and do thank you, panel, for your questions. And we come now to the last portion of our forum, of our debate. As we said at the beginning of the program, each of you candidates will be asking the other candidates a question. The candidates will be given 2 minutes each to respond. Again, the order of questioning has been determined by a drawing of lots, which was done earlier in the week. Now we will have the first question from Mr. Ash.
I'm very proud that President Reagan has supported my candidacy for the United States Senate, as well as Vice President Bush. I would like to ask my 2 opponents to name who they support for President of the United States and to give the reasons why they support that individual.
The first response, Mr. Gore.
Well, of course, I support Walter Mondale, but of course, again, the presidential race and the U.S. Senate race are very different, separate, and distinct. Now, I was asked previously, are my views closer to those of Mr. Mondale or closer to those of President Reagan? And my response is that if it comes to questions involving the protection of the environment, then my views are closer to those of former Vice President Mondale. If the question is what are your views on the strategic buildup, then my views are that President Reagan is correct in seeking to build the MX missile and the B-1 bomber, and to seek a bipartisan approach to arms control negotiations. If the issue is fairness, then I think former Vice President Mondale has a better commitment there. If the issue is tax indexing, then I support President Reagan's view on that question. Where foreign policy is concerned, I think that President Reagan is correct in saying no more embargoes, and I think Vice President Mondale is also, but I also favor his approach to having a moratorium on the collection of farmers' home loans that are outstanding. If the issue is TVA or a commitment to public power, I oppose the position of the current administration as was articulated by the Council of Economic Advisors, or a member of them, when they wanted to raise the rates for hydroelectric power. Now, finally, I think that one of the overriding issues that we have to address as a country is the budget deficit, and we need a bipartisan commitment in the first 100 days after the inauguration to bring Democrats and Republicans together in an effort to reduce the budget deficit, to take the pressure off interest rates and sustain the economic recovery. And that is yet another reason.
All right, thank you, Mr. Gore. Mr. McAteer, your response to Mr. Ash's question.
I think anyone and everyone that knows me knows that I have supported President Reagan for 10 years. I'm not changing that now. I happen to believe that he's the best president that we've had in our lifetime. Unfortunately, Dick Lugar from the state of Louisiana, from Indiana, and Mr. Howard Baker chose to preempt the privilege of the people of Tennessee in the Republican primary and deprive me of the opportunity to be the Republican nominee. But I do not change with every drift of the wind. Mr. Reagan is a constitutionalist. He believes in the things that I believe in. I support him still very strongly. I happen to believe that I will bring people into the voting booth on November 6th, multitudes of them, who will be voting for Mr. Reagan. It is unthinkable that anyone would vote for Ed McAteer and vote for Walter Mondale. Our philosophies are 180 degrees different. He's a social welfare statist. He does not believe strongly in the free enterprise system. He believes in big government spend. He believes in a weak national defense. He believes that the Soviets do not mean what they say when they say that their goal is world domination. He does not understand, I do not believe, that they know how to use military power for political purposes. And unfortunately, I had to run as an independent to take my message to the people of Tennessee, but I do that with enthusiasm, I do that with hope, I do that with belief that when the people of Tennessee really know who these three candidates are, and when they understand that November 6th is a very important critical day, and that their representation in Tennessee will be best represented by Ed McAteer, who believes as they do believe, and is not for sale, does not suffer from the chapped finger to see which way the wind blows before he makes a decision. I believe that they will be voting for Ed McAteer.
All right, thank you, Mr. McAteer. Now it's your turn to ask a question.
All right. Now, my question is, and I've lost my question here. My question is, do I direct this to one?
No, the question is to both
All right.
the other candidates.
All right. To both the candidates, both of you are Albert Gore, rather, and Howard Baker, joined in supporting the Grove City College Bill, the so-called Civil Rights Act of 1984. This bill was chiefly sponsored by Robert Packwood and Edward Kennedy. That bill makes private colleges with a Christian orientation subject to federal regulation, even when such colleges have never discriminated, or even when they have never accepted any federal funds. How do we know that you two gentlemen will not sacrifice religious liberty and academic freedom on other issues as well if you happen to be representing the people of Tennessee as their next senator?
All right, Mr. Ashe, it's your first response.
I'm strongly opposed to discrimination based on race, color, creed, or sex, and I will fight to eliminate bigotry wherever it can be found. In regard to the Grove City College matter, which legislation passed the U.S. House of Representatives and apparently has been killed in the United States Senate, it goes much further than simply overturning the Grove City College decision. If that's all it did, I would support it. But as Senator Hatch has pointed out, and Senator McClure and others, by redefining the question of federal aid recipient, farmers in Tennessee, mom and pop grocery store owners, as well as pharmacists and others may be included under the various anti-discrimination acts and thereby have to fill out mammoth tons of red tape and additional forms which are not needed. That was not required prior to the Grove City College decision and should not be required now. What I favor is returning the law to the situation as it existed when the Grove City College case was filed. I do not favor the legislation that is currently before the United States Senate, which goes much, much further than it should go. And I think it needs a thorough hearing, and we need to know exactly what the ramifications of that particular piece of legislation are. It should not, during midnight sessions and all-night sessions, when people are weary and sleepy and not knowing what they're doing, be called upon to pass legislation which may very well, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, in effect put farmers under these laws, which they have not been before and should not be today.
All right, thank you, Mr. Ashe. Your response, Mr. Gore.
Yes, first of all, I strongly disagree with the analysis of the law which is under discussion. Let's talk about exactly what was done, first of all. The law which previously was passed allowed the cutoff of funds to schools if they discriminated on the basis of sex and relegated women to second-class citizenship and did not support women's athletics. Well, people at the University of Tennessee know how important women's athletics are. In fact, the women's teams here at the University of Tennessee have been achieving national recognition, and women's athletes have achieved national recognition and worldwide recognition in the Olympics. I have 3 daughters who are active in sports, and I think they ought to have the same opportunities in athletics when they go to school as my son will have when he goes to school. Now, there was a court decision called the Grove City decision, which greatly narrowed the scope of that law and said that if discrimination did take place, then funds couldn't be cut off to the school in order to enforce the law. The only thing they could do is look at the specific incidents of discrimination against women and go in and look at that one program or that one sport. Now, I think that that's an ineffective remedy. I think the law should be enforced. And the civil rights law, which was written to react to that court decision, is intended to take the law right back to where it has been operating for this whole time prior to the Grove City decision. I believe the law should be restored to the way it was before the court decision, because I believe very strongly that women should not be discriminated against when it comes to athletics. And I say again that here at UT, we have some of the best examples anywhere in the country of why we ought to do away with that kind of discrimination.
All right, thank you, Mr. Gore. Now it's your turn to ask your question of the other two candidates.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question that Frank Barnett might ask if he was here on this stage with us this evening. I'd like to ask both of my opponents, do they think that our state was well served by the decision of the Republican Senate Campaign Committee to come in and render the state's Republican primary moot and try to designate a nominee? And also, would they support a law preventing national parties from interfering with state parties and rendering their primaries moot?
Your response, Mr. Ashe.
I might say, first of all, I'm glad to have Frank Barnett's support for the United States Senate, just as I have President Reagan's support. The issue at hand is that any group that wants to has a right to support the candidate that they feel would best serve in a particular public office. And a proposal such as Mr. Gore made probably would fall flat on its face under the concept of free speech. The fact of the matter is, the real issue in this race for the United States Senate is leadership. Whether or not one of two teams will be elected to serve America in Tennessee. Will it be the Mondale-Gore team and a $157 a month tax increase, the proposal that they offer, or will it be the Reagan-Ashe team, which President Reagan has succeeded in bringing inflation down from 14% down to 4%, bringing more jobs to America and to Tennessee, 154,000 more jobs, bringing interest rates down from 21.5% to 12.75%, by ensuring that we wage war on waste and inefficiency as opposed to the Mondale-Gore $85 billion tax increase. That's not the way we want to head in Tennessee or in America. And that's what this campaign is all about. The leadership that I've shown as a member of the Tennessee House of Representatives and the Tennessee State Senate, as an independent member, calling attention to abuses and to fraud and to waste where they've existed, and sponsoring legislation, yes, that has helped this campus, with the Art and Architecture building, with the Walters Life Science building, the School of Veterinary Medicine, the renovation of the Claxton Education building. That's what this campaign is all about. Which of the gentlemen standing here tonight can best reflect Tennessee's needs? And yes, the presidency is related to the Senate race, because a senator must vote on the president's proposals. They would not have passed if Mr. Gore's vote against the tax cut, against the balanced budget amendment, against the B-1 bomber, for the nuclear freeze, and a host of other issues in which he has regularly voted against the president and with Walter Mondale had prevailed.
Mr. McAteer, your response.
Obviously, I do not agree with Mr. Baker and Mr. The senator from Indiana, their decision to come in and preempt the people of the state of Tennessee and their right to select their candidate. Now, I'm not for any legislation telling people what they can make decisions along of. However, I do believe that the people of Tennessee are, as I've said, common sense people who, given the opportunity through the right kind of leadership that can allow them to give free expression to their ideas, their talents, and their abilities, they know how to select the person that they want to represent them. If I was limited to one word and as to what America needs most today, that one word would be leadership. Leadership in the homes of America, in the business community, in our educational institutions, and yes, in government. There are two sources of power in America. One is in Washington, D.C., one is among the people. The power in Washington, D.C. is represented by 545 people. 435 of them are U.S. congressmen, 100 are U.S. senators, 9 Supreme Court justices, and the President of the United States. The other source of power in America is among the 235 million citizens. To me, it's unthinkable that those 235 million people cannot control the action of those 535 in Washington. I've never met a person yet who voted for inflation. I've never met a person who voted for budget deficits. Both Democrats and Republicans are against these things, but yet we have them. So I think we see an inconsistency among elected officials who talk about the horrors of inflation, budget deficits, and all of these problems. I think it's high time that the people of this country wake up and get a common sense person in Congress who has a business background, a family background, a military background, who has the courage of his convictions to represent them in the U.S. Senate.
Mr. McAteer, thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen, for keeping very close to your times, and because you've done that, we've ended up with some extra time. So what we're going to do is give each of you...
Go back to the panel.
No, we're going to give each of you 90 seconds. 90 seconds for a closing statement. We're going to do it in the order that you chose by lot to ask questions. So it will be Mr. Ashe, Mr. McAteer, and Mr. Gore in that order. 90 seconds for a closing statement. Beginning with Mr. Ashe.
To reiterate, the reason I'm running for the United States Senate is to make a difference for Tennessee, a difference for America. And that difference is clearly illustrated with the choice that's at hand on November the 6th. Whether or not you want the Mondale-Gore ticket or whether you want the Reagan-Ashe ticket. It's more than a ticket, it's a team. And the coach of the team can't be successful unless he has players on the team that are willing to back him up. Mr. Gore, in his answer on why he supports Walter Mondale, gave the most interesting zigzag approach that I've ever listened to in my entire life. More Washington gobbledygook. You didn't know any more why he was supporting Mondale at the end of the answer than you did at the beginning. And I think Tennesseans deserve straight answers, not zigzag answers. And the question tonight is, in 4 weeks from tomorrow, when we go to the ballot box to determine who will serve Tennessee until the end of this decade, is whether or not we're going to have a senator who will support economic recovery, who has a record that indicates support for the tax cut, for tax indexing, for bringing jobs to Tennessee, keeping inflation down, keeping interest rates down. And my record in the state legislature of always supporting a balanced state budget is a record that I'm proud of, a record my constituents are proud of. And I solicit your support and your help in ensuring that the next senator from Tennessee is not just from Tennessee, but is truly a senator for Tennessee. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Mr. Ashe. Mr. McAteer, 90 seconds for a closing statement.
I have been on the campaign trail for a year now with Victor Ashe, and I like Victor as an individual. I've only recently met Albert Gore, and I like Albert Gore. I like both of these young men. I'd like to have them as my neighbor, but I don't want either one of them performing bypasses on me. That takes a special person to do that. And based on their voting record, the things that they have said, and through their, I believe, inordinate desire to be a senator, I don't think that they're basically bad people. I think that they suffer, as I've said before, from the winds of political realism. There was a time in this country when we could afford some of that. But today, as indicated by Mr. Bush's vote recently, breaking the tie in the U.S. Senate on the MX missile, we must have people that understand from a business standpoint, from a historical standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, the importance of leadership in the U.S. Senate. I have said on the other two debates, my friend Congressman Larry McDonald, murdered a year ago by the communists on 007, in his last speech before he boarded that plane, he quoted Ezekiel 3:17, which said, "Son of man, I have set thee to be a watchman to the nation. Therefore give them warning from me, and as they hear my voice." I'm urging the people of Tennessee, if you've never done it before, forsake party labels one time, vote your conviction as well as your conscience,
Thank you,
with
Mr.
your
McAteer.
head as well as your heart.
Mr. Gore.
Thank you very much. Again, I want to thank you for co-hosting the debate, and I hope those of you watching the debate have enjoyed it. I know you understand how important this Senate race is to the future of Tennessee. It's not just an extension of the presidential race. Tennesseans need a senator of their own who will fight for them and stand up for you. Tennesseans don't want a coat tailor or a rubber stamp. They want someone who is effective. You know the central issue in this campaign is very simple. Who can do the best job? Who can be the most effective voice for Tennessee in the United States Senate? I believe the best way to answer that central question is to just compare the performance of the candidates. In my own case, as I said earlier, I've had town hall meetings at the grassroots level, and if I'm privileged to serve in the Senate, I'll have them all over this state. I believe in making democracy work the way it's supposed to work. I've maintained a 98% voting and attendance record in Washington, and more importantly, I have taken the ideas of Tennesseans at the grassroots level and put them to work in Washington. The National Organ Transplant Act, the Infant Formula Act, the Health Fair Program, the laws on controlling hazardous waste disposal. I pledge to you that if I'm privileged to serve in the Senate, I will give you hard work and dedication and that level of commitment cited in Ecclesiastes. Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with all thy might. I believe we have the ability to rise above our fears and pass on to the next generation what America has always given her children, a future with hope.
Mr. Gore, thank you very much. Mr. Gore. So that there be absolutely no bias in this audience, let's have a round of applause for all three candidates. Thank you, audience. Thank you very much, audience. I must commend you. You were fairly good. Gentlemen, Mr. Gore, Mr. Ashe, Mr. McAteer, thank you so very much for being with us. I think you all performed admirably, and we appreciate you taking your time to give us an insight into each of your own candidacies. And the panel, we appreciate you being here. All of us at Channel 10 are very happy to have been able to jointly sponsor, along with the Knoxville Journal and with the University of Tennessee Issues Committee, this forum, this debate. We thank you, the viewers, for being with us, and we certainly hope that you have a very good night.